When Katherine deliberately spilled red wine on Imani's white dress at the charity gala, she thought she'd finally put her brother-in-law's wife in her place. But as the crimson stain spread across the elegant fabric, no one expected what would happen next, especially not the billionaire watching from across the room. The crystal chandeliers of Grandview Manor cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as 300 of the city's elite mingled in their finest attire. The annual Sterling Family Foundation Charity Gala was the social event of the season, where old money met new power and philanthropic gestures masked decades of carefully guarded privilege. Among the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, Imani Johnson Sterling moved with quiet grace, her white silk evening dress a stark contrast to the ornate opulence surrounding her. At 32, Imani possessed the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be bought or taught. Her Harvard law degree hung in the corner office of her environmental justice firm, but tonight, surrounded by her husband's family, those accomplishments felt invisible. She had learned to navigate these gatherings with diplomatic patience, understanding that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Michael Sterling stood near the bar, his architectural eye admiring the restoration work done on the manor's eastern wing. At 35, he was the golden child of the Sterling legacy, successful enough to earn his family's respect while remaining distant enough from their more unsavory business practices to sleep peacefully at night. When he'd married Imani 3 years ago, he'd naively believed love would be enough to bridge the chasm between his wife's values and his family's expectations. Tonight, watching his mother's cold smile as she introduced Imani to guests as Michael's friend, he was beginning to understand how wrong he'd been. Katherine Sterling Crawford glided through the crowd like a predator in pearls, her 29 years of privilege worn like armor. She had spent the evening orchestrating what she considered subtle social warfare, positioning herself strategically to intercept conversations whenever Imani approached a group. Her marriage to Harrison Crawford had secured her place among the city's most established families, but her brother's choice of wife remained a constant source of irritation. Tonight, she had decided, would be the night she finally put an end to what she saw as an embarrassing chapter in the Sterling family story. In the far corner of the ballroom, Dr. Harrison King observed the evening's proceedings with the sharp attention of someone who had built an empire by reading people in situations others overlooked. At 65, his weathered face and simple black suit stood in stark contrast to the peacock displays around him. His presence at tonight's gala wasn't coincidental, though none of the Sterling family knew the true reason for his attendance. He had been following Imani Johnson Sterling's career for months, ever since her landmark victory against Meridian Chemical had saved an entire Louisiana community from toxic poisoning. Tonight, he hoped to finally meet the woman whose work had caught the attention of environmental advocates across the nation. Patricia Sterling commanded the room from her position near the silent auction display, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her emerald necklace catching the light with every calculated gesture. At 58, she had spent decades perfecting the art of social manipulation, understanding that true power lay not in what you said, but in what you made others believe. Her son's marriage had always been a source of frustration, but she had learned to view challenges as opportunities. Tonight, she watched Katherine's movements with approval, recognizing the familiar choreography of a well-planned social execution. As the evening progressed, the subtle hostilities became increasingly obvious. Conversations halted mid-sentence when Imani approached, only to resume in hushed tones once she had passed. Introductions were awkward, with Patricia consistently forgetting to mention Imani's professional accomplishments, instead focusing on how lovely she looked or how interesting her background must be. Michael found himself caught between worlds, his loyalty to his wife warring with a lifetime of family conditioning that made confrontation feel impossible. The turning point came during the cocktail hour, when Katherine cornered Imani near a display of orchids imported specifically for the event. With the practiced charm of someone who had weaponized social grace, Katherine began what appeared to be a sisterly conversation about the challenges of fitting in to established social circles. "You know, Imani," Katherine said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to overhear, "I really admire how you've managed to adapt to our world. It can't be easy coming from such a different background. Her smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem supportive while cold enough to deliver the intended sting. Imani recognized the familiar dance, the coded language of exclusion dressed up as concern. She had encountered it in boardrooms and courtrooms, in faculty lounges and at dinner parties. The suggestion that she was an outsider trying to adapt rather than a successful professional who belonged wherever she chose to stand. "Thank you for your concern, Katherine," she replied evenly, "though I'm not sure what you mean by adapting. I've always been myself." The response clearly wasn't what Katherine had expected. She had anticipated defensiveness, perhaps anger, something that would justify the escalation she had planned. Instead, Imani's calm confidence seemed to deflate the carefully crafted provocation. Catherine's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she recalibrated her approach. Of course," Katherine continued, moving closer as if sharing a confidence. "It's just that some people understand our traditions, our way of doing things, and others." She let the sentence hang in the air like incense, heavy with implication. "Well, let's just say that breeding shows, doesn't it?" The word breeding landed like a slap, and both women knew it. Around them, conversations continued, but Imani could sense the subtle shift in attention, the way peripheral awareness focused on their exchange without appearing to. This was theater, she realized, a performance designed for an audience that was pretending not to watch. Dr. King, however, was watching intently. From his position across the room, he couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged, but he recognized the body language of confrontation disguised as conversation. He had seen similar dynamics play out in boardrooms and country clubs, the practiced cruelty of those who confused inherited privilege with inherent worth. His interest in the evening's proceedings sharpened as he observed how Imani maintained her composure under what was clearly a calculated attack. The formal program began with Patricia taking the stage to welcome guests and highlight the foundation's charitable work. As she spoke about the importance of giving back to the community, Imani couldn't help but notice how the definition of community seemed to exclude the very people who most needed the resources being celebrated. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days fighting for environmental justice for communities these same people had helped poison through their business investments and political donations. It was during the transition between speakers that Katherine made her move. She approached Imani with 2 glasses of red wine, her expression a masterpiece of feigned warmth. "I thought you might like some wine," she said, extending one glass while keeping the other. "It's a particularly good vintage from the Crawford family vineyards." Imani accepted the glass graciously, though something in Catherine's manner set off internal alarms. There was a theatrical quality to the gesture, a sense of ceremony that felt disproportionate to the simple act of offering a drink. Around them, other guests seemed to pause in their conversations, as if sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "You know," Katherine continued, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. About fitting in, I mean." She stepped closer, ostensibly to speak more intimately, but Imani noticed how the movement positioned them in clear view of the maximum number of guests. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of slow motion. Katherine raised her glass as if to toast, then stumbled with what appeared to be elegant clumsiness, the full contents of her wine glass arcing through the air to splash across the pristine white silk of Imani's dress. The deep red liquid spread across the fabric like blood, staining not just the dress, but seemingly the very air around them with sudden, shocked silence. "Oh my goodness!" Katherine exclaimed, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of perfectly performed horror. "I'm so clumsy. Your beautiful dress. I'm absolutely mortified." Her words carried across the ballroom, drawing every eye to the spectacle unfolding near the orchid display. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people seemed to hold their breath collectively, waiting to see how this moment would resolve itself. Some faces showed genuine sympathy, Others barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing what appeared to be social humiliation served up as entertainment. Patricia Sterling watched from across the room, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes bright with something that might have been approval. Michael started forward immediately, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but Imani raised her hand almost imperceptibly, a gesture that stopped him mid-stride. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of fleeing to the bathroom to attempt damage control, instead of accepting Katherine's offer of help with cleaning up, instead of playing the role of victim that had been so carefully scripted for her, Imani did something completely unexpected. She set down her wine glass, removed her stained silk shawl with deliberate grace, and walked directly to the podium where the evening's program was meant to continue. The movement created a ripple effect through the crowd. Conversations died entirely as guests realized that the woman in the wine-stained dress wasn't retreating but advancing. She wasn't hiding her humiliation but transforming it into something else entirely. Dr. King found himself leaning forward, his business instincts recognizing the rare moment when someone refuses to accept the role they've been assigned. Imani reached the microphone and paused, looking out over the sea of surprised faces. The red stain on her white dress was impossible to ignore, a scarlet letter that should have marked her as a victim of social warfare. Instead, she wore it like a badge of honor as she began to speak. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. "I'm Imani Johnson Sterling, and I want to tell you about another kind of stain that doesn't wash out quite so easily." The opening caught everyone off guard. This wasn't the script they had expected, wasn't the response that had been anticipated. Katherine's perfectly prepared follow-up lines died on her lips as she realized her carefully orchestrated moment was spiraling beyond her control. "3 months ago," Imani continued, "I stood in a courtroom in Louisiana, representing the families of Riverside Gardens, a predominantly black community that had been systematically poisoned by industrial waste for over 2 decades. The children in this community couldn't drink their tap water. Their parents developed cancer at rates 3 times the national average. Their elderly grandparents watched their gardens die from soil contamination that made the earth itself toxic." The ballroom remained absolutely silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. Where moments before it had been expectant, almost predatory, now it carried the weight of genuine attention. These were people accustomed to charity galas and fundraising speeches, but this wasn't a request for donations. This was testimony, delivered with the kind of authentic passion that couldn't be performed or purchased. The company responsible for this devastation had assets worth over $800 million. Imani's voice gained strength as she spoke. "They spent 6 years fighting our lawsuit, arguing that they couldn't be held responsible for problems they claimed they didn't cause, despite internal documents proving they knew about the contamination from the beginning." Dr. King found himself completely absorbed in her words. He had read about the Riverside Gardens case, had followed the legal proceedings with professional interest, but hearing the story told by the woman who had lived it, fought it, and won it was entirely different. This was why he had come tonight, why he had spent months researching her background and accomplishments. "When we finally won," Imani continued, "when the court ordered a settlement that would clean up the contamination and provide medical care for the affected families, the company's lawyers made a final argument. They said that people like the residents of Riverside Gardens should be grateful for any kind of settlement, that they should know their place and accept whatever they were offered." The phrase, "know their place," hung in the air like an indictment, and several guests shifted uncomfortably as they realized the parallel being drawn. Katherine's face had gone pale, the triumphant glow of her earlier victory replaced by something approaching panic, as she understood where this speech was heading. "But here's what those lawyers didn't understand." Imani's voice grew stronger, more confident with each word. "The families of Riverside Gardens didn't need to know their place because they already knew it. Their place was in homes where their children could drink clean water. Their place was in communities where the soil could grow food instead of tumors. Their place was in a world where the color of their skin didn't determine whether they deserved to breathe clean air." The applause started slowly, tentatively from the back of the room. Dr. King was the first to clap, his weathered hands creating a sound that seemed to give others permission to follow. Within moments, the entire ballroom was applauding, not the polite social applause of charity events, but genuine appreciation for truth spoken with courage. Michael felt tears of pride threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. This was his wife. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, standing in front of his family's friends and peers and revealing the kind of strength and purpose that made their petty social games look like exactly what they were: the desperate clinging to relevance by people who had confused wealth with worth. But Imani wasn't finished. As the applause died down, she continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had found her audience and her moment. Tonight, someone thought they could humiliate me by staining my dress. She gestured to the wine-soaked fabric, transforming what had been intended as a symbol of her defeat into evidence of her adversary's failure. They thought that a little red wine would put me in what they considered my proper place. But I've learned something from the families of Riverside Gardens, something that no amount of money or social position can teach. The silence in the room was now complete, absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in recognition that something historic was happening in front of them. I learned that dignity isn't something that can be stained or washed away. Respect isn't something that's given by others, it's something you claim for yourself. And your worth isn't determined by how others see you, but by how clearly you see yourself. Dr. King had heard enough. He rose from his seat at the back of the room and began walking toward the podium, his movement causing heads to turn and whispers to start. Most of the guests recognized him by reputation, if not by sight. His philanthropic work and business empire made him a figure of considerable influence, but few could understand why he was approaching the woman in the stained dress. "Excuse me," he said as he reached the podium, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I believe we have something to discuss." Imani stepped back from the microphone, unsure what to expect, but maintaining the poise that had carried her through the evening. Dr. King took the microphone with the ease of someone who had addressed countless audiences, but when he spoke, his words were directed at her as much as to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that I came to this gala tonight for one specific reason. 3 months ago, I read about a legal victory that represented everything I believe philanthropy should accomplish. Not charity given from above, but justice fought for and won by those who refuse to accept injustice." He turned to face Imani directly, his expression serious but warm. "Mrs. Johnson Sterling, your work with the Riverside Gardens case caught my attention not just because of the legal victory, but because of how you achieved it. You didn't just file a lawsuit. You lived in that community, breathed their air, drank their water, and fought their fight as if it were your own." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Katherine felt the blood drain from her face as she began to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. This wasn't just about family politics or social positioning. This was about real power, real influence, and she had just spent the evening attacking someone who was about to be publicly honored by one of the most respected figures in philanthropy. "For the past 6 months," Dr. King continued, "I have been searching for the right person to lead a new initiative, the King Environmental Justice Foundation. This foundation will have resources of $500 million to fight exactly the kind of battles you've been winning, Mrs. Johnson Sterling. Tonight, after witnessing your grace under pressure and your commitment to justice even in the face of personal attack, I would like to formally offer you the position of Chief Executive Officer." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. This wasn't the pause of anticipation or the quiet of attention. This was the stunned silence of people realizing they had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. The woman in the stained dress, who had been deliberately humiliated just minutes before, was being offered one of the most powerful positions in environmental advocacy. Michael's pride threatened to overwhelm him completely. Patricia Sterling's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the calculating mind beneath as she realized how dramatically the evening's power dynamics had shifted. Katherine stood frozen, the architect of her own defeat, understanding too late that her wine-staining gambit had not only failed, but had provided the very catalyst for her target's greatest triumph. Dr. King wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's something else you should know, Mrs. Johnson Sterling, and something this room should understand about the courage you've shown tonight. The Riverside Gardens case didn't just expose environmental racism, it exposed a network of companies and investors who had been profiting from environmental degradation for decades." He paused, his eyes finding Katherine in the crowd with laser precision. "One of the companies your lawsuit brought down was Crawford Industrial Holdings, which had been dumping chemical waste in minority communities across 3 states. The settlement you won didn't just compensate the victims, it bankrupted a company that had been poisoning people for profit." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Katherine's husband's family company had been one of the defendants in Imani's lawsuit. The wine-staining hadn't been just about racism or social positioning, it had been about revenge, about punishing the woman who had cost them millions of dollars and exposed their environmental crimes to public scrutiny. But the revenge had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliating Imani, Katherine had provided her with the perfect stage to demonstrate exactly the kind of character and courage that Dr. King had been looking for. The wine stain, intended as a scarlet letter of shame, had become a red badge of courage. The applause that erupted this time was sustained and genuine, recognition not just of a feel-good moment but of justice being served in real time. Michael finally moved toward his wife, his face radiant with pride and love. Patricia Sterling found herself clapping despite her better instincts, recognizing defeat when she saw it, and understanding that grace and victory might serve her family's interests better than continued hostility. Katherine had vanished into the crowd, her perfectly orchestrated evening having become the instrument of her own social destruction. The wine stain she had created as a symbol of humiliation had become something else entirely, a mark of triumph, a badge of honor worn by someone who had refused to be diminished by small minds and petty cruelties. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many approached Imani to offer congratulations and apologies for the earlier treatment she had received. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had been Michael's friend at the beginning of the evening was now recognized as Dr. King's chosen leader, someone whose work had national significance and whose character had been tested and proven under pressure. 3 months later, Imani stood before a congressional subcommittee, testifying about the need for comprehensive environmental justice reform. She wore a striking red suit, the same color as the wine that had been meant to mark her humiliation. In the gallery, Michael sat wearing a pin with the King Foundation logo, his face still showing the same pride that had overwhelmed him that night at Grandview Manor. The wine stain had long since been cleaned from the white silk dress, but the lesson it taught remained perfectly preserved. Sometimes the very thing meant to break us becomes the catalyst for our greatest triumph. Grace under pressure reveals character, and character, not pedigree, not social position, not inherited wealth, determines true worth. In a world that often mistakes cruelty for strength and privilege for power, the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to be diminished can change everything in a single moment of truth. Katherine's attempted humiliation had failed, not because it was poorly executed, but because it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who Imani Johnson Sterling was. She wasn't someone trying to fit into their world. She was someone working to make the world better for people they had forgotten existed. And on the night when that difference became clear to everyone in the ballroom, the stain that was meant to mark her downfall became the moment of her greatest victory.